Power is often assumed to fear rivals only when it is weak. Yet Russia's anxiety toward NATO has persisted not in moments of collapse, but during periods when authority appeared consolidated, borders formally secured, and command publicly unquestioned. The contradiction is quiet, but persistent. An authority that projects endurance behaves as though time itself is hostile. Expansion elsewhere has been tolerated, economic pressure absorbed, internal dissent managed. But a defensive alliance, inching closer without firing a shot, has been treated not as a policy challenge, but as a historical threat. The unease does not emerge from NATO's present actions alone. It comes from the way Russian authority remembers power, how it was lost, how it was taken, and how quickly legitimacy can evaporate when borders cease to feel absolute. The terrain that shapes this fear is not abstract. It is geographic and institutional. From the western plains that carried Napoleon's armies to Moscow, to the corridors used by German forces in 2 world wars, Russia's leadership has inherited a map etched with invasion routes rather than natural barriers. The Russian state expanded repeatedly, not from confidence, but from exposure. Buffer zones were not luxuries, they were doctrines. The Soviet Union formalized this logic after 1945, converting devastation into a perimeter of satellite states enforced through treaties, military presence, and political obedience. When that perimeter dissolved in 1989 and 1991, it did not merely reduce territory. It dismantled an architecture of control that had defined authority for nearly half a century. NATO's existence predates that collapse, but its meaning changed afterward. Originally a fixed counterweight to a known adversary, it became, from Moscow's perspective, an institution without a stopping point. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic entered first. The Baltic states followed. Each accession was legal, negotiated, and framed as defensive. Each was also irreversible. Russian leaders were not confronted with an invading army, but with a shrinking margin for strategic interpretation. Authority that had once commanded obedience across Eastern Europe now faced an alliance advancing through treaties rather than tanks. The ground did not move, but the rules governing it did. Within the Kremlin, this shift produced a peculiar distortion. Power was no longer measured solely by capability, but by proximity. NATO's presence near Russia's borders came to signify not immediate danger, but historical replay. Institutions remembered what armies once did. Authority absorbed those memories and treated them as forecasts. Decisions were filtered through precedent rather than probability. Military planners and political elites did not ask whether NATO intended to attack. They asked whether the structure allowed Russia to prevent being surrounded again, constrained again, negotiated over again without a seat at the table. This is where authority began to erode its own flexibility. Russian leadership framed NATO not as a collection of states, but as a single expanding will. Nuance collapsed into continuity. Diplomatic signals that might have slowed escalation were interpreted through the lens of betrayal, particularly the informal assurances, disputed and undocumented, that NATO would not expand eastward. Whether those assurances were binding mattered less than how they were remembered. Authority converted memory into obligation and treated its violation as a threat to legitimacy itself. The pressure intensified as domestic authority stabilized. Under Vladimir Putin, the Russian state reasserted control over media, political opposition, and regional elites. Energy revenues restored confidence. Military reforms followed. Yet with consolidation came a narrowing of acceptable outcomes. Retreat, once possible during weakness, became unthinkable during strength. To concede NATO's expansion was not merely to accept a strategic loss, it was to admit that authority no longer shaped its environment. That admission carried internal risks. A leadership that justified its rule through restoration could not easily explain why restoration had limits. Over time, NATO's growth was woven into a larger narrative of encirclement. Missile defense systems in Eastern Europe were framed not as safeguards against Iran, but as rehearsals for neutralizing Russia's deterrent. Military exercises were interpreted as tests of response time. Political outreach to Ukraine and Georgia became symbols of an unfinished rollback of Russian influence. Each event, isolated, was manageable. Together, they produced a cumulative pressure that authority struggled to recalibrate. The contradiction deepened. Russia retained one of the world's largest nuclear arsenals, vast territory, and a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Yet its leadership behaved as though the loss of strategic depth endangered survival itself. Power became preoccupied not with what it could do, but with what it might no longer be able to prevent. Memory, institutionalized through doctrine and rhetoric, constrained interpretation. Authority responded less to present capability than to historical trauma encoded as strategy. This dynamic reached a fracture point not when NATO crossed a formal red line, but when Russian leadership concluded that delay itself was erosion. The longer Ukraine remained outside Russian control, yet inside NATO's orbit of influence, the narrower the future appeared. Authority perceived time as favoring the alliance, not because of troop movements, but because of normalization. Once NATO's presence became accepted at Russia's doorstep, reversing it would require a level of force that could no longer be justified as defensive. At this juncture, legitimacy became inward-facing. Russian authority did not need external approval. It needed coherence. The narrative of resurgence depended on demonstrating that history had not ended with the Soviet collapse. To allow NATO's continued expansion without response risked exposing a limit to that narrative. The fear was not invasion. It was precedent. The precedent that Russia's objections could be acknowledged, discussed, and ultimately ignored. Yet the response to this fear carried its own distortions. By treating NATO as a monolith, Russian authority reduced the space for selective engagement. By framing security as zero-sum, it dismissed arrangements that might have preserved ambiguity. Power hardened its stance precisely when adaptability was most needed. The institutions that remembered invasion began to generate strategies that invited confrontation, not because it was inevitable, but because authority no longer trusted delay. The fracture did not announce itself as collapse. It appeared as certainty. Decisions were made with the confidence of necessity rather than choice. Alternatives were acknowledged only to be dismissed as naive or dangerous. Authority convinced itself that control remained possible if action was decisive enough. The fear of NATO, rooted in memory, transformed into a justification for narrowing Russia's future options under the guise of protecting them. And so the tension persists. Russian authority continues to operate from a position of formal strength, commanding obedience and projecting resolve. Yet beneath that projection lies an unresolved question. When power is guided less by present conditions than by remembered losses, does it preserve security, or does it begin to confuse history with destiny? If these questions matter to you, you'll find more of them on Timeless Questions, exploring power, belief, and meaning across time.